When spiritual awakening begins, a person rarely understands that it is not a rise toward the light, but a process of breaking old bonds. At first, it feels like consciousness is expanding, like a closeness with the world is emerging. But very soon, another feeling appears: separation. This is exactly what Carl Gustav Jung wrote about. He called it the law of consciousness. The clearer you see, the further you move from those who are still asleep. Awakening does not unite, it separates. This is not a punishment, but a natural consequence of the soul's growth. Jung believed that most human relationships are built on unconscious agreements. We share the same illusions, believe in the same symbols, worship the same images of success and happiness. This creates the illusion of connection. But as soon as a person begins to see these mechanisms, they lose the ability to participate in them. They can no longer pretend not to notice falsehood, insincerity, fear. And at that moment, the first form of loneliness appears, the loneliness of the one who sees. Jung wrote, "The price of consciousness is isolation. This isolation is not physical. It is a state in which you realize that you are speaking different languages with people, even though you use the same words. You see not only actions, but their motives. You feel not only emotions, but their roots. This knowledge makes it impossible to continue participating in collective games as before. You begin to notice that conversations about life, success, and love no longer touch you. They sound like noise from another world." Why does awakening separate? Because it destroys collective myths. Jung called these myths forms of the unconscious, archetypes that govern human behavior. As long as a person is identified with them, they feel part of society. They live by borrowed meanings and therefore are not alone. But when archetypes lose their power, a person steps beyond the familiar world. And there, in that emptiness, their own path begins. Jung did not see this transition as a crisis, but as the birth of true individuality. He wrote that awakening is not a state of peace, but a painful operation. The old self dies, while the new one is only beginning to form. This Promazutagni stage is always accompanied by a sense of loss. A person loses identity, loses belonging, loses former people, but at the same time, an inner strength is born that no longer depends on external recognition. Can this isolation be avoided? Carl Gustav Jung answered, "No, because consciousness is always individual. Collective consciousness connects through shared illusions, while individual consciousness razrus at them. That is why an awakened person is forced to seek new forms of connection, deeper, more honest ones. But before they appear, one must pass through the desert." Jung wrote about the hero who must leave the tribe to face his inner dragon. This is a symbolic image of the path toward the self. The hero cannot remain in the village, because there he is held back by the fears and expectations of others. He must go alone. In the same way, a person entering the process of individuation must leave collective consciousness, not out of pride, but out of necessity. When you begin to see the world clearly, you lose the ability to remain as you were. This is the moment of separation. You see how people run from pain, how they hide behind masks, how they fear silence, and you understand that you can no longer be part of that dream. But it is precisely then that real life begins, because only in solitude can a person hear their own voice. Jung called this the awakening of the soul. He said that this process is rarely accompanied by joy. Rather, it is an encounter with reality, the very one we long avoided. But without this encounter, it is impossible to become yourself. Awakening does not promise comfort. It promises truth. And truth is always the beginning of freedom. The second stage of awakening is the realization that you begin to see what others do not notice. Jung called this psychological vision. He wrote that a person who has passed through the shadow develops the ability to perceive not only external behavior, but also the hidden layers of reality, motives, complexes, repressed images, inner conflicts. This kind of vision cannot be turned off. It becomes a constant state of consciousness, and it is precisely this that makes an awakened person truly alone. Imagine being in a room where everyone is laughing and talking, but you see anxiety beneath their smiles, pain beneath anger, fear beneath pride. You see their wounds, their inner knots, their shadows, and you understand that no one wants to notice them. Try telling someone that their anger is not strength, but a defense against vulnerability, and they will turn away. Try saying that their pride is a form of fear, and they will resist it. Carl Gustav Jung wrote, "Show a person his shadow, and he will consider you his enemy. This is the loneliness of the one who sees." You perceive more deeply than collective consciousness allows, and the price is the inability to be understood. You become a witness to the unconscious as it manifests everywhere, in words, in gestures, in silence. You see how a person repeats the same patterns, unaware that they are living inside a loop of their own complexes. You observe how projections move between people. One idealizes, another blames, a third tries to rescue. And all of it is a play of the unconscious, where no one knows the rules. Jung noted that this ability to see becomes a burden. It takes away the simplicity of communication. You can no longer look at people without an inner analysis. You cannot pretend not to understand the causes of their actions. Conversations become superficial, because you see what lies beneath the words. You sense how the unconscious speaks through people, how their fears shape their opinions, how their pain dictates their choices. Many of Jung's patients describe this state in similar terms, as if there were a transparent wall between them and others. On the outside, familiar life, smiles, conversations, routine. On the inside, the silence of an observer who can no longer be a participant. One of them said, "I see people's shadows moving with them. I hear the conversations of their fears. I cannot tell them this, because they would think I've gone mad. So I remain silent." Jung referred to this as the loneliness of the seer. A person capable of seeing the unconscious becomes a keeper of invisible truths. He knows that if he speaks the truth, he will be rejected. And if he remains silent, the knowledge will crush him. So he learns to remain silent consciously. This silence is not weakness, it is a form of maturity. It protects those who are not yet ready to see from being. Such vision brings pain, but it also liberates. Because now you are no longer living in a dream. You stop being a prisoner of collective illusions. You see reality as it is, no matter how difficult it may be. And this vision is the first sign of true consciousness. Carl Gustav Jung wrote that to see the unconscious is to carry light into darkness. But light always blinds those who are not ready to look. That is why the path of the one who sees inevitably passes through loneliness. Yet it is precisely in this loneliness that a depth is born, one that cannot be acquired in any other way. When a person begins to see more deeply than others, the next stage of awakening arrives inevitably. It is the collapse of the previous system of meaning. Jung called this the loss of collective meaning. Everything that once seemed important, career, status, recognition, success, even social approval, loses its weight. a silence appears in which familiar words no longer carry substance. A person realizes that they were living not by their own values, but by borrowed ones. And in this realization, a special kind of loneliness is born, a loneliness of meaning. Jung wrote that collective consciousness offers ready-made forms of meaning. It tells us that happiness lies in achievement, love in possession, spirituality in submission to external models. These meanings simplify life because they provide direction. But awakening destroys these constructions. A person begins to see that all these forms of meaning are social agreements, created to maintain order, not to reveal the soul. And when they collapse, the person is left without support. Many describe this moment as an inner collapse. Everything that once motivated them stops working. What once seemed like the peak turns into emptiness. A person realizes that their aspirations were not authentic. They worked for recognition, loved for security, learned for approval. And now, when the illusions have vanished, one question remains: what is there to live for? Carl Gustav Jung argued that it is precisely at this moment that true individuation begins, the search for personal meaning that cannot be collective. He wrote, having freed himself from shared meanings, a person must create their own, but individual meaning cannot be transferred to the collective. This inability to share inner experience makes the path especially difficult. Now you can no longer explain what success or happiness means to you. You use the same words, but they point to different realities. For some, success is recognition; for you, it is inner balance. For others, love is possession; for you, it is growth. You speak the same language, but live in different worlds. Jung called this semantic loneliness. A word loses its shared meaning and becomes a personal symbol. You say, life, but mean a process of inner transformation. Others hear, life, and think of everyday struggle for comfort. This separation is difficult to bridge. That is why many who awaken begin to remain silent, to avoid distorting their meanings. They participate in conversations, but inwardly they no longer belong to those topics. Viktor Frankl, influenced by psychoanalysis and existential philosophy, wrote that a person can endure anything except meaninglessness. When the collective system of meanings collapses, the search for authentic meaning begins, something that arises from the depth of the individual, not from external pressure. This search is always personal and always accompanied by solitude, because no one can tell you what your meaning is. It must be brought forth from within. Jung did not see this as a tragedy, but as a necessary stage in the formation of the individual. He said that individual consciousness cannot develop while a person is bound by collective illusions. Therefore, the destruction of previous meaning is an act of purification. In the emptiness where cozy goals once existed, space appears for something new. And this new emerges slowly, from the depths of the unconscious, from those archetypes that once created illusions but now help build inner truth. The path to oneself always passes through a loss of meaning. If before a person asked society what is right, now they are forced to ask the silence within. This is frightening, because there are no guarantees. But only in this uncertainty does authentic meaning arise. When the imposed disappears, what remains is something alive. And this living truth cannot be explained, it can only be lived. When former meanings collapse, a person faces an even more painful truth. They begin to see that most of their connections were never real. Carl Gustav Jung called this the moment of projection dissolution. Before awakening, a person does not live with others, but with their own reflections, with the shadows of their unconscious. They fall in love not with another, but with their own projection of the anima or animus. They admire not a friend, but a potential within themselves that they have not realized. They hate not an enemy, but their own rejected part. When these projections begin to dissolve, the connections disappear with them. Jung wrote, "The withdrawal of projections reveals a terrible truth. Most relationships were not relationships, but inner dramas." A person suddenly realizes that there was no true closeness, only psychological mirrors. And when those mirrors shatter, emptiness remains. They look at those who once mattered and see not a divine image, but an ordinary person, without the glow of idealization, without hidden enchantment. And with this comes a sense of loss, as if someone dear has died. But it is not love that has died, it is the illusion. Jung called this process retrospective loneliness. This is the realization that a person has been alone their entire life. They simply did not know it. They lived within the psychodrama of their unconscious, where each figure played the role of an inner complex. The mother became a figure of support, the father a source of guilt, the partner a mirror of the fear of abandonment. When these roles disappear, only bare reality remains, and for the first time a person encounters others without masks. This destruction often feels like the end of the world. People you once considered close suddenly become distant. Conversations lose depth. Relationships become difficult, because now you see their structure from within. Carl Gustav Jung wrote that a true meeting between people is possible only when both have withdrawn the projections. But this is rare. Most continue to live within unconscious roles. And the awakened person finds themselves outside this game. They begin to notice how others unconsciously seek not connection, but confirmation of their illusions. Some want to be saved. Others need admiration. Some create conflict to avoid confronting their own vulnerability. All of this becomes transparent. And the clearer you see it, the harder it becomes to remain close, not out of contempt, but out of inner incompatibility. This is a period of inner emptiness. Old connections have dissolved, new ones have not yet formed. Jung wrote that during this time a person undergoes a psychological death, the loss of false foundations. But only after this death is a true meeting possible. As long as projections live within you, you do not see the other person, you see only a reflection of your own unconscious. True intimacy becomes possible only when you can encounter another as an independent being, not as an extension of your own complexes. Jung warned that after the withdrawal of projections comes a stage of complete isolation. Not because the person rejects others, but because they can no longer participate in illusions. This period of loneliness is not a choice, it is a consequence of honesty. Only by accepting this emptiness can one form connections based on reality, not on psychological reflections. Carl Gustav Jung wrote, "A true relationship arises only between two whole individuals. Everything else is dependence." That is why loneliness at this stage is not a defeat, it is preparation. It clears the space for a real encounter. It destroys what is false so that something living can appear within a person. And if you feel that your connections are falling apart, do not rush to save them. Sometimes destruction is a form of healing. In these ruins, the true capacity for love begins to grow. When false connections dissolve and a person is left alone, the final and most important stage of awakening begins. Jung called it the phase of the hermit. This is not an escape from the world, nor a rejection of others. It is a necessary stage of inner birth, in which the soul finally stops playing cozy roles. Everything that supported the old personality, expectations, approval, masks, social identities, must dissolve to make space for the true self. Jung wrote, "The birth of the true personality requires the death of the social one. As long as a person is bound to the opinions of others, they live as a reflection, not as an essence. They speak to be liked, choose to avoid rejection, think as is expected. And in doing so, they lose their inner center. That is why nature demands isolation. Only in solitude do the voices of others fade. Only in silence does your own voice begin to sound. This period is painful. A person feels empty, as if everything that once defined their life has disappeared. But it is precisely in this emptiness that Jung saw the possibility of true autonomy, the emergence of an inner core independent of the external world. He wrote that the self is not the ego and not the mask, but a deep center that unites the conscious and the unconscious. And to hear this center requires time, silence, and solitude. Jung compared this process to the transformation of a caterpillar into a butterfly. The caterpillar must withdraw into the cocoons so that its presnar form can die. Inside the cocoon, there is disintegration, not improvement, but dissolution. Only after that does a new structure emerge. The same is true for a person. To become themselves, they must allow the old self to die. Without this death, there is no renewal. For Carl Gustav Jung, loneliness is not an enemy, but a space of alchemy. It is an inner laboratory where opposites are united, light and shadow, strength and weakness, consciousness and the unconscious. Here, a person stops seeking love outside, because for the first time they find it within. They discover not emptiness, but presence. Not isolation, but a deep connection with themselves. Many fear this state because they confuse it with rejection. But in reality, it is not a withdrawal from the world, it is preparation for a new type of connection, conscious, mature, free from dependence. Jung wrote that only the one who has passed through loneliness is capable of a true relationship. Because now they do not seek salvation in another, do not demand, do not project. They meet the other while remaining themselves. At this point, loneliness transforms into presence. A person experiences an inner fullness that no longer requires validation. They realize they were never truly alone, because within them there has always been a source, a deeper consciousness, what Jung called the self. This silence becomes their home. From it arise new relationships, new meanings, a new life. Jung wrote, "The one who dares to be alone finds a world within themselves. This is not the end of the path, but the beginning of true existence." After a long journey through shadows, loss, and emptiness, a person finally meets themselves. And then loneliness ceases to be suffering. It becomes a space of truth.